paper was that there is a let me set the context here. So Mike Stay and I are working on what we call the logic as distributive law algorithm for generating logics from models of computation. And we're utilizing this in Casper as a kind of compression mechanism. So we use in the logic as distributive law version of Casper, the blocks, the contents of the blocks are described by logical formulae. So if you think about it, the idea is you can describe a collection extensionally, so you can list out all the things that are in it, right? So I could say, you know, this set contains the numbers 1, 2, and 3, or this block contains transactions A, B, and C. You can also describe collections intentionally or programmatically. So, for example, I can describe the set of all even counting numbers, right? So that's a rule for determining what's in the set and what's not in the set, right? So you can think of that as a kind of recognizer. So someone might present a counting number and say, and ask, is this in the set? And the way to determine that would be to go and check to see its evenness. So calculate, you know, calculate the remainder mod 2. And another approach that's different from recognizers is generators. So you could create a stream of numbers of all the counting numbers. So you can create a little tiny program that is the stream of all the counting numbers, and you can filter them for the even numbers, creating a stream of even numbers. So that's a generator. In each of these cases, what we've done is we've applied a kind of compression, right? So we've used a programmatic representation of this infinite set to enable us to write down in a small finite space this infinite set. So formulae, at least under the logic as distributive law idea, do the same kind of thing. They provide a kind of compression, right? So when you say, for example, all the transactions that are in this namespace, so all the transactions that are using this collection of addresses, where you again might give the collection of addresses either extensionally or intentionally. So that gives you a kind of compression, because then you can write down in a tiny little formulaic statement or a tiny little program a large collection of transactions. So the logic as distributive law applies to Casper because what you can do is get a different notion of what's in a block, and that makes it possible to kind of sidestep a lot of discussions about block size, because you're using a different way of describing blocks. So that's how we're applying it. And the algorithm itself is something that we've been refining and making sure that we have all the mathematics laid out. And the maths are very, very cool. One of the things that we realized was that there are two kinds of implication. There's sort of the truth table implication that probably most people are familiar with, or at least most programmers are familiar with. Truth table implication is sort of like you take implication and you interpret it as, so A implies B would be interpreted as not A or B. And you can just, you know, fill in values of truth for A and B and see what the values of A implies B would be under those different conditions. So for example, if you said that A was false and B was true, so that not A or B, so not false is true, and true or anything, but in this case it's true. True or true is true, right? So that gives you a sense of the truth table interpretation of implication. There are other interpretations of implication that are quite relevant here. And it's interesting to contrast those other notions of implication with the implication that shows up in the logic as distributive law that's relevant to this discussion. So one implication is that you can think of implication as recording the type of a function. So A implies B. It means that if I had an A, I could produce a B. So I can make B's from A's. And that obviously corresponds to function types, where the input is of type A and the output is of type B. Now, in one of the most interesting observations in computer science in the last 40 years has been this observation that you can decompose that a little bit further in a way that's different than the truth table decomposition. So the decomposition that was observed by Jean-Yves Girard when thinking about linear logic is to say that A has a resource-like quality. If you can produce many copies of B from a single A, or you can reuse A inside the calculation of producing B, then there's something magical about that resource. You know, it's an inexhaustible supply. So if you say, well, it takes $1 to produce, you know, a third of a gallon of petrol, then you don't get to reuse the dollar, right? And that's all very important when we talk about the blockchain space and double spin. And so Jean-Yves Girard decomposed the sort of usual implication into an operator he called bang, or it's one of the linear exponentials, which you can think of as a kind of storage. So if you can make a store of A and retrieve an instance of A from the store, then that gives to produce B. Then that's the logical implication that we normally think of. But there would then be a corresponding linear implication, which says that you get to use exactly one instance of A, so like $1, to produce that third of a gallon of petrol. So that's a more recent decomposition of implication, but that's not the implication that we notice. And this implication is, and it turns out to be quite relevant for our algorithm. So the implication that we're looking at has to do with eventually. So eventually you reach a state. So after observing, so you think about it in terms of events, right? So after observing the event A, eventually we may observe the event B. This is the kind of implication that shows up in our semantics accounts, or it's the kind of decomposition of implication that shows up in our account of the semantics. And it's quite powerful because it allows us to internalize the rewrite rules of your computation system. So just to be clear about what I mean by rewrite rules, an example of a rewrite rule might be one of the transitions of the Ethereum virtual machine, or one of the transitions of the Java virtual machine. Another example might be the beta reduction rule in the lambda calculus, or the COM rule in the pi calculus. So each of these are kinds of rewrite rules. They take the program state together with some contextual information, such as the heap and stack and registers of a virtual machine, and based upon the program state, convert it to a new state along with potential modifications to the state of the virtual machine, or whatever the context is. All right, so in this, those are examples of rewrite rules. So from the rewrite rules, we have a notion of transition and eventually, right? So eventually means after some number of rewrite rules, we get to some state. And then what you'd like to do is be able to describe that state. So here we have an implication that says from an A, or observing the event A, we, after some number of rewrite steps, see B, or observe B. So that's kind of the idea. And it turns out that when you do that, then you have to go and look at how eventually interacts with all the other monads that are lying around. So in particular, you have to ask how the eventually interacts with the collection monad. So what do I mean by the collection monad? Well, if you remember back at the top of this little discussion, I mentioned that we can think of formulae as collections, as intentional descriptions of collections. The vast majority of collections that programmers deal with are monadic in nature. So if you look at like list or set or tree collections like that, then they satisfy a sort of very general API. People can, I wholeheartedly recommend people becoming familiar with that API. I frequently call it shape, wrap, and roll. But there are different ways to think about the monadic API to collections. Another way to think about the monadic API to collections is the familiar select from where design pattern that we see in SQL and other kinds of databases. If you're going to interpret formulae as collections, then you need to sort of say which kind of collection it is, and that's characterized in the collections monad. So once you've provided a collections monad to our algorithm, then there's an obligation that the eventually monad interacts in a friendly way with the collections monad. So Mike and I were both in New York this past week at an event at the Microsoft Technology Center that was blockchain focused, and Vitalik was there too, we went over those laws, making sure that all of the ones that we needed in order to make sure everything worked out in the general case were true as a part of preparing for this paper. So that's the one of the updates. I know I've been talking for quite some time. There is one other update, but I'll just stop and just check in and see if all of that made sense.
I'm tracking pretty well.
Cool. Is that Thomas Greco? Oh, okay. Anyway, so I'll move on since they're that seem to be okay. The other thing I've been working on is I like to make sure that the algorithms I work on make sense in the natural and physical world. I don't have a lot of confidence in things that don't find some kind of purchase in the physical world. It's another kind of QA process. So one of the things that I've been looking at for several months now is the consensus process amongst bees. Being a beekeeper, this is quite interesting to me. But the consensus process amongst bees for selecting a new site. So beehives fork like blockchains can fork. And then when they fork, typically this is because there are two queens. Usually what's going on is the incumbent queen goes around and eats the other possible queens. But if there comes a time when she can't eat all of them, or it's too slow, or the hive is too big, a new queen will emerge, and then the new queen will gather up some of the hive and leave. So typically, she will take with her about 10,000 or so bees. And what will happen is the swarm, which is quite docile, actually, it's quite interesting. You stick your hand in a swarm and not get stung. So what will happen is the swarm will leave the hive and go about 200 or 300 yards away and settle like on a tree branch or something else, and then they will seek for a suitable nest site. And so some number of scout bees will go and look for a site to host the new hive. And it turns out that there's a very specific evaluation criteria for suitable sites. And so scouts will, when they find a candidate site, will come back and they will dance. They will do the bee waggle dance, which is sort of like a figure eight, and where the angle of the figure eight relative to the sun shows the direction, and the amount of wiggling that they do. They waggle their tail end. That says how far. So any bee coming in contact with this dance can know, the direction and the length, so they communicate a vector to the candidate site. Now, the other thing about the dance that's quite interesting is the total number of circuits that they do around the little figure eight, and that number of circuits represents, at least according to the recent research, the enthusiasm about the suitability. It's a proxy to the suitability of the site according to the specific evaluation criteria. So if you think about this, this is very, very similar to Casper. If we think about the scouts as the validators, and we think about the site proposals as next block proposals, then there's a fairly tight correspondence. But there's one thing that the bees do that Casper doesn't do, and that is the bees don't necessarily evaluate all the block proposals. They're much, because it actually costs resources to fly from the swarm to the site, they're much more likely to evaluate proposals that have more stake behind them, i.e. more circuits around the figure eight. And if you work out the math, this gives a very, very this gives a better probability of convergence, that they are more likely to not even look at or evaluate proposals that that aren't enthusiastically advertised. So that's one interesting thing. And so we might think about a modification to Casper that relates enthusiastic advertisement to whether or not to even evaluate the proposal. Of course, the thing that the bees do is the thing that the bees don't do that Casper does do. To the best of my knowledge, I don't know any research that suggests that there are such things as Byzantine bees. So bees don't lie, to the best of my knowledge. Whereas there can be Byzantine validators and Byzantine proposals. So there are some subtle differences between the domains, but still it's quite useful to see that there are decentralized and distributed consensus mechanisms that are being employed. The author of Honeybee Democracy, the principal source of the research that I'm looking at, also argues that a very similar thing is happening in the brain, with very, very high degree of correspondence between the elements of the honeybee swarm site selection consensus and certain processes across the neurons in the brain. So I like to make sure that these physical processes, if there is a good check to see that the algorithms I'm working on have correspondences, not the least of which because then I get to use things like honeybees as a part of my QA team. So, all right, so those are my updates. Any thoughts, comments? Anyone else have any updates?
Well, this is the second time I've heard this explanation, and it's awesome and motivating. So the vigorousness in which the bees dance around is would be associated with what, the amount of stake that the validators have on a particular
it's roughly akin to the amount of stake behind a particular block proposal.
Got it. That is across several validators.
Yes. Yes. Although, yeah, it's subtly different, right? The bee is dancing her enthusiasm,
right?
Whereas a block proposal may have more stake than just the stake from a single proposer.
But would there in the bee would there be several scouts dancing for the same nest?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, so yeah, exactly. So if you look at what happens in the aggregate, right? The bees. The research suggests that the bees are just taking random walks through the swarm and encountering some of the proposals, right? So if you have two sites, one of which is very, very suitable and one of which is only so-so, right? And a bee that encounters both is more likely to go to the enthusiastic one. And a bee that encounters only one of them, right, will go to both. If you keep iterating the probabilities, right, very, very quickly, the likelihood that a bee taking a random walk through the swarm will encounter one that was enthusiastically advertised is much, much, much greater.
Got it. And then in the honeybee democracy, when the swarm splits, or there's two large sets of scouts, do they sometimes they fork forever, and sometimes they all end up at the one new site, right?
That's correct. Actually, there's some very interesting research that was reported by the PhD advisor of the guy who wrote Honeybee Democracy. So Lindauer, who's a famous naturalist and biologist who studied honeybees, reports an observation about a swarm where there were two sites and the hive just could not come to consensus. They were split. And then at one point they take off and the swarm splits. And they lose the queen.
Oh.
And they can't find the queen, and so they settle back down where they were swarming and they die.
Oh my God. They have
no direction. They hang out there for a few days and die.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Well, the reason I was asking was if there were some parallel problems to that in Casper, where there's two block proposals and it's difficult to make a decision between.
Yes. So there. When we come up against FLP impossibility, right? So there are going to be situations where network conditions or other kinds of conditions cause a mean that you can't converge, right? And so you have to have some kind of timeout, which is what's happening with the bees, right? They're under very, very tight timeout, right? If they don't find a new site within some number of days, they run out of food, right? They don't have any honey that's theirs because all the honey is in the hive, right? And so they do have a hard timeout. Likewise, you have to have some kind of synchronicity assumptions in order to overcome FLP impossibility. So yeah, and when you have those timeout assumptions, then something's going to happen. Either you're going to reset, you launch a new consensus algorithm, or you'll force the situation in one shape or in one way or another.
That's cool. So to bring the conversation back to the Licks paper, has that been submitted, or tell me again where that's at in the process?
Yeah, so the deadline is today. No, the deadline is tomorrow. And so yeah, we're just nailing down everything and we'll submit it. I think we may have a little extra wiggle room, so to speak, because usually they want like an abstract and then the paper. So we're probably going to add some diagrams for the coherence laws.
Okay, awesome. Good luck.
Thanks. Yeah. Cool. Did Jack jump off? Okay. Cool. Well, if there's no other updates, I'm happy to yield back 30 or 29 minutes to everyone who came today.
Oh, would Thomas like to introduce himself? Maybe, maybe not. Okay. Thanks, Greg.
All right. Take it easy, guys. Have a good one.
Sorry. I was just listening. But thank you, Greg and Ed.
Thanks, Thomas.
Yeah, maybe I'll have some questions next time.
Okay. All right. Well, I can ask you a question. Was any of that sensical? Did that make sense to you?
Yeah. It was useful. It was interesting. I'm following much more recently with Casper through the stand up either here or on YouTube, and following along in the Skype channel. That's mostly Vitalik talking. But yeah, it's all coming together a bit slowly, but I think maybe in a few weeks' time.
Slowly for you or slowly for us? I always feel like we're moving too slowly, but hey, if you're going to run trillions of dollars through this system, maybe it's a good idea to go slow.
Yeah. No, it's fine that you guys go very slow. Even more slowly better, because of course I'm going very slow in understanding it.
Cool. Understood. Cool. All right, guys. Well, have a good day. We'll talk again soon.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Peace.